Over the years, the Sternritter as a faction have received their fair share of criticism, and as a weekly reader of the Thousand Year Blood War arc, I was privy to most of it, with those criticisms ranging from this enemy group is far too bloated for any of them to have any meaningful impact, to your average Sternritter is both underdeveloped and underutilized, while at the same time being overpowered. And all of that encompassed this idea that the Sternritter on the whole were unrelatable, unsympathetic, and basically just a bunch of throwaway villain names with no redeeming qualities. As a self-confessed pretty big fan of the Sternritter and the Vandenreich as a whole, however, I'm not here to dispute those criticisms. What I am here to do, however, is to say that not every Sternritter falls into that mould, and that there are some who break free of it and become truly great characters to really rub shoulders with some of Bleach's best bad guys. And the subject of today's character analysis, Sternritter H the Heat, Bazard Black, or Bazz-B, is absolutely one of those. Bazz-B is a real success story for the Sternritters in general. He's one of the most memorable characters from their entire group. He has a wonderful ability set and a true emotional core in his relationship with Yugram Hashwolf. But that being said, not everything is smooth sailing with this character either, and there is some weirdness here as well. So in this video, we're going to do our deep dive look at the character of Bazz-B, who, when reduced to a rudimentary level, could be compared to someone like Grimjo or someone like Renji, but I do think there is a bit more nuance to this character as well. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well, as it does help to support me and the channel. It just hopefully means we'll get more traction on the YouTube algorithm. And if you really like what I do here and you want to support me another step further, I do have a Patreon for the channel as well, where you can get videos like this one early and you can support me for as little as $1 a month. Everyone who is supporting me currently is coming up on screen right now. Thank you guys so very much for helping me do what I love. I really appreciate it. One of the most common and yet popular tropes that you will see crop up time and time again in Bleach is this idea of an antagonistic duo. Whether the enemy faction is the Gotei 13, the Espada, Execution, or the Sternritter, the underlying formula remains mostly unchanged, and you will always find this idea of an antagonistic duo within their ranks. Two characters who are so diametrically opposed that their clash of ideals is inevitable, that their personalities are total polar opposites, yet we see them together, they interact a lot quite often to really highlight that juxtaposition, that dichotomy of personalities. Generally speaking, one half of this duo will be cold, calm, quiet, standoffish, generally quite distant from the rest of their team, but have a general reverence for the idea of law and order and authority. Meanwhile, the other half of this duo is the opposite. They are passionate, they are fiery, rebellious in nature, and crucially have a disdain for authority. Of course, really the first principal version of this duo is found in Byakuya and Renji in the Soul Society arc, and is then replicated again in Ulquiorra and Grimjo in the Arrancar arc, although I could make an argument for this idea of an antagonistic duo beginning as early as Ichigo and Uryu in the Agent of the Shinigami arc as the true progenitors of this notion. This idea of an antagonistic duo does find its way into the Lost Agent arc, although it is flipped on its head ever so slightly. Ginjo and Tsukishima do fit this mould, although Ginjo is the rebellious one with the hatred of authority, and he's actually the main villain of the arc, whereas Tsukishima is actually the lackey. And crucially, what all of these characters have in common outside of their shared personality templates is that they all grow to have a real rivalry and relationship with the main character, Ichigo himself. And that brings us nicely onto the Thousand Year Blood War arc. Now, the Thousand Year Blood War arc absolutely follows this formula for the most part. It has its own version of an antagonistic duo in the Sternritter Grandmaster Yugram Hashwolf and Sternritter H Bazz-B. The crucial difference with these guys, however, and what makes them different wholly in comparison to their predecessors, is that they have little to no interaction with Ichigo whatsoever. And it really changes the dynamic. It makes them really weird characters overall. Hashwolf is less affected by this. Normally, you know, the quiet, calm one would be one of the big endgame bad guys of the arc, Byakuya, Ulquiorra, Tsukishima. And Hashwolf manages to kind of stay in that mold thanks to his positioning within the Vandenreich, the fact that he is literally the right-hand man of the Emperor Yhwach himself. So Hashwolf is not too affected by this change, and he kind of builds that relationship and rivalry with Uryu anyway. But where does that leave Bazz-B? When everything is said and done, if he has no relationship with Ichigo, he doesn't really build a relationship really with any of the main characters, and yet he's supposed to hold that kind of importance, the same as a character like Renji or Grimmjow. Where does that leave him? Well, it kind of leaves him floating in the ether. And I really do like Bazz-B as a character. I think he's a really great character, but I think this decision on Kubo's part to, in many ways, remove Ichigo from the equation in the Thousand Year Blood War speaks about larger volumes of that final arc in general, but on a more personal note, it does leave Bazz-B feeling a little aimless, a little directionless, yet Kubo still wants him to feel like he has a significant role to play. Now, I'm not saying a character has to be affiliated with Ichigo to play a truly significant role, but these characters generally represent tentpole adversaries for Ichigo to overcome on the path of his development. Normally, fighting one of these characters is a major milestone moment in Bleach, and Ichigo doesn't really have that in the Thousand Year Blood War. In many ways, this makes sense. Ichigo's development, for the most part, is totally done by the time the second invasion rolls around, but it does mean that characters like Bazz-B are robbed of that same purpose that his predecessors before him had. So what we have here is a character that I think Kubo wanted to be important, but didn't know what to do with him overall. So really, Bazz-B just flits around from place to place, getting involved in different scenarios across the second invasion, and then kind of having a revenge, betrayal storyline tacked on at the last minute. And we'll talk about why I think it feels a little tacked on later, although I do think it's good, and I do think emotionally it is resonant, and it works pretty well. But as far as the Sternritter go, Bazz-B has a pretty impressive manga lifespan, starting out on chapter 490, a mere 10 chapters into the final arc, and lasting all the way through to chapter 634. And he does have a pretty sizable role in this arc. He is definitely one of the most memorable Sternritter. He does play up to that Renji archetype a bit, but I would argue he is probably the most well-developed of that archetype since Renji himself. When you look at the Sternritter, you see maybe some parallels to previous villains, and I think it's very easy to look at someone like Bazz-B and write him off as a Grimmjow clone, or just saying he's the Grimmjow of the Sternritter, but I think doing so is reductive, and it is a disservice to Bazz-B's character. They have their similarities, most of which I outlined in their personality template, essentially this idea that they don't like authority, you know, that they kind of maybe look down on other people, they think they're the strongest of their particular race. But I would argue that where Grimmjow is kind of unhinged, and it's like the hollow nature inside him makes him crazed and like just lusting for battle all the time, Bazz-B is more nuanced. He's definitely more intelligent, I think, and he goes about things a bit more meticulously. And I think it makes for a really interesting character. On the outside, he has that gruff, rebellious nature that you come to know from this kind of punkish, roguish character. But I think there is more depth to him. I think he is smarter than he lets on as well, and I think that makes for an interesting and dangerous bad guy. Let's talk about Bazz-B's visual design before we move on to his role in the story, and I just think he looks so damn good. Normally, I don't go in for these punk, roguish characters more than their counterparts. I admit it, I prefer the kind of cold characters in general. But I do like them all regardless. I mean, I'm hard-pressed to find a Bleach character that I don't actually like. I think, regardless of any faults or whatever, I like most of these characters, even if it's just from a design standpoint. But Bazz-B's design is top-notch. I think of the Sternritter, he looks so good. He's one of the slightly more grounded members of the Sternritter, but he has that those aspects that make him memorable, give him that memorable silhouette. Of course, his brilliant pink mohawk, of course, is the main thing, which he takes great pride in, which is a lovely little character nugget. But I like the smaller details as well that Kubo really goes into with this character. The fact that his Quincy cross is dangling around his neck on a small chain. The fact that his earrings are actually nuts and bolts, I think is, again, so good. That's such a nice little detail that lends this kind of industrial vibe to Bazz-B. He has like these big unlaced boots on again that look really cool, and these black gloves, and I just think he has this really good aesthetic, and it's really cool to see. But it is interesting to see Kubo working and tweaking on these characters, evolving them as the story went on. It does feel like a lot of aspects of the Sternritter were kind of being finalized week by week, because we don't see Bazz-B an awful lot early on, but when we do see him, when he jumps Yamamoto, he has a different outfit on. Not wholly different, he seems to still have his armbands, but he's got the more traditional Sternritter gear on. His boots are also a totally different colour. But it's cool to see Kubo finalising and changing their designs, and when he lands on one that he loves for Bazz-B, I think it works really well. And of course, like I said, his personality, I think, is an interesting one. He is that kind of punkish archetype within the Sternritter who spits on authority and wants to do things his own way. But it's not tiresome. I think it's really interesting that he is definitely calmer, cooler than characters like Grim Joe, although he can be fired up, pardon the pun, when things get going. But Bazz-B's a weird character. He is a really weird character. I always got the impression that he was like really quite smart, quite savvy in a way, and maybe that's just down to how Kubo portrays him. But regardless, I think he's a really cool character to fill this archetype. So regarding Bazz-B's role in the Bleach story in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, he is one of the most visible of the Sternritter. He has some of the most exposure out of the lot of them, but like I said, his role is weird, nebulous, hard to define. It seems like he does just float around picking fights with people without any real agency, without any real kind of impact. And I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think it's good to have this continuous through line, this face of the Sternritter who's showing up in different places, interacting with different characters. But I think, and this is purely speculation, but you kind of look at the story as Bazz-B is presented, and it feels like Kubo wanted him to have a decent-sized role, and wasn't really sure where to take the character until quite late on into the story. Right down into the nitty-gritty. I think Kubo decided finally that he was going to have Hashloth and Bazz-B have this almost brotherly relationship that has dissolved over the years, which turned out to be one of the most compelling aspects of the character. But I also, before we get started on his story, his role, to kind of coincide with his visual design, I want to talk about his shrift briefly, the heat. What could have been a pretty generic fire-based ability actually turns into one of the most creatively designed flame abilities in the series. Easily one of the best shrifts, not necessarily in terms of strength, although it's no slouch either, but in terms of its visual depiction, I just love what Kubo did with this guy. It's totally memorable, which is a problem a lot of the Sternritter have, that they're just not memorable. Their abilities are too vague or too weird or just too out there. Bazz-B has an ability that's very akin to a typical Bleach power set, and I think that makes it really memorable. Basically, his abilities all revolve around his hand, although he also has a burning stomp attack, which never comes back. But that's kind of cool as well. But basically, Bazz-B's attacks are called Burner Finger. So he has Burner Finger 1, 2, 3, 4, and then burning full fingers when he uses every single finger. And it sounds kind of weird, but in practice, it is really good, and it's really effective. So like Burner Finger 1, for instance, he just points his finger at his enemy and snipes them with like a concentrated beam of fire, which we see him use a few times in the series. Burner Finger 2, he kind of brings down both fingers in like a massive slash, which is one of the most devastating looking attacks we get to see. Burner Finger 3, he kind of like melts the ground around him and turns it into lava, sending this massive wave of the ocean of fire crashing down upon his enemy. Burner Finger 4, he puts his hand like that and creates a big flame blade. And then Burning Full Fingers, he puts his hand out in front of him, and this spiral of fire comes off of his fingertips. It's cohesive. It works really, really well. I just think it's great. I love seeing the little speed lines that come on his finger when he does the attack, and they also come on his shoe when he does his Burning Stomp move as well. Now, while Bazz-B's Shrift the Heat is mostly showcased through these Burner Finger abilities, earlier on, that wasn't always the case, as we see at the start of his battle against Hitsugaya that actually he's using the heat in a different way that doesn't really ever return, focusing more on conjuring and controlling waves of fire, sending it flying towards Shinigami, sending it flying towards Hitsugaya and Rangiku, but also showcasing some form of temperature control, as we see that he's able to melt Hitsugaya's ice simply by being near it, as we see when he's pinned to the wall, he frees himself basically by doing absolutely nothing. And then when Hitsugaya throws some ice at him later, he's shown to basically cause it to turn to water without doing anything at all, similar to Harabel's Herviendo ability. But Bazz-B doesn't seem to have to do anything to make this happen. So whether Bazz-B is just passively radiating intense heat all the time is difficult to say. But it does seem like there is more to the heat than just these stylized burner finger powers, which is essentially all we get after this fight is over. And one other small but cool detail regarding Bazz-B's Shrift that really goes to show just how much detail and attention Kubo gave it can be found in Bazz-B's volume poem, which reads, "I bent bullets, claws, battle flags, and short swords with my fingers." And that's clearly a reference to each individual Burner Finger ability. Burner Finger 1 is like a gun, it's like a bullet being fired that snipes an enemy. Burner Finger 2, Bazz-B rips it across his opponent like a pair of claws. Burner Finger 3, then, the flowing lava must be akin to a battle flag billowing in the wind. And Burner Finger 4, the sword, is pretty self-explanatory, but that's a really, really awesome detail that I think just really brings this Shrift together. There's also the question of how powerful actually is this Shrift and how much of that power comes from Bazz-B himself. He makes the rather bold claim that the only reason he, as not Nananajacoup, survived Yamamoto's strike in the first invasion is because he offset Yamamoto's flames with his own. Now, we do see Bazz-B in the aftermath of that attack, and he is looking pretty worse for wear, but admittedly alive. But the fact that he is looking pretty rough tells me that he took the brunt of that attack, and when he says he offset Yamamoto's flames, it's difficult to gauge exactly what that means. How much of it was he actually able to deflect with his own fire? At the end of the day, it's still pretty impressive because those other two Sternritter owe him their lives in that scenario, which is really cool. But it does call into the question just how powerful actually is this guy, especially since Ryujin Jaka is a real benchmark for how strong not only fire-based abilities are, but just abilities are in general in the world of Bleach. But just in general, Bazz-B's clearly a very well thought-out character from a visual standpoint. Like, he's a Sternritter, we get to see his bow and arrow, and it's a crossbow, which I think is, again, great for this guy. Like, it gives off that kind of... It's kind of weird to say because, like, you don't really associate a bow and arrow with being thuggish or anything like that. But as opposed to perhaps the elegance of a traditional bow and arrow, a crossbow does feel a bit more roguish. I don't really know, but I think it fits him perfectly. Like, the way he points it like a gun at people is just so good. And I think, you know, I can't gush enough about how much I think Bazz-B's Shrift is excellent. And it helped to really... And Bazz-B... So let's talk about this briefly for a second as well. So another issue with the Sternritter, and I want to do a video where I discuss what I think are genuine flaws with the Sternritter from a fan's perspective. And one of those flaws is that a lot of the Sternritter are, I guess one note is the perfect way to say it. They exist seemingly because of their Shrift, and they exist to espouse their Shrift, and that's about it. Like, I absolutely love Asnot, but the guy talks about absolutely nothing but fear. You know, that's all he talks about is just fear. And then you've got characters like Nyanzol Weisel, who just talks about the fact that he twists and turns things around. You've got characters like Gerard Valkyrie, who basically just talks about miracles all the time. And then you have Sternritter like Bazz-B, and it's this distinction that makes him feel like a much more fleshed out character. And honestly, I think that is the key place to look to see which Sternritter really did get the most kind of love from Kubo, is their way of talking. Bazz-B basically never mentions heat or fire or anything like that because it's not what defines his personality, it's just his abilities. And I think that is really cool. If I had one area to criticise Bazz-B, it's his Volstendig, which is just terrible. It's so bad that I don't even know what Kubo was thinking, because it should have been so easy to do an awesome Volstendig for this character. It seems like the terrible, tiny little wings are just supposed to be representative of Burner Finger, but maybe I'm missing something here, and if I am, please do let me know, but I think this is pretty bad as far as Volstendig, and I think Bazz-B deserved better. It was weird to even show his Volstendig if it's so lame. You could have draped him in fire akin to Yamamoto's Bankai or something like that. Anything would have been cooler. Just giving him flaming wings would have been better than just giving him a couple of bars. I'm guessing it's supposed to be representative of Burner Finger, but it seems weird. Why not, if you're going to do that, why not be representative of Burning Full Fingers and give him at least 5 lines coming off like that? Give him something. The Volstendig he has is pretty bad, and that's one of my really only criticisms regarding this character's visuals. But if we move on to his plot overview, you will see that this character does an awful lot of hopping around, basically moving from place to place, never really staying in one area. Bazz-B's an interesting character in a plot perspective because he is one of the Sternritter that we felt like we kind of knew early on, but he doesn't really do anything until close to the second invasion, much like Askin Naklavar. Bazz-B shows up a bit more than he does, but still, despite many of us thinking that despite not really seeing Bazz-B much, many of us kind of associated him early on with the Sternritter. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is that Bazz-B is clearly one of the characters on the initial colour page on chapter 480. It seems to me like, I would argue the majority of those Quincy in the background are either unfinished designs or just characters that never really came about. Hashwolf, that's clearly supposed to be him. I would argue the character in the middle is supposed to be Uryu, and then the person who looks bald with the earrings is probably supposed to be Bazz-B. But again, I think that probably changed around a little bit in development. But because of that, we kind of thought we knew this character early on, and then you see him in chapter 490, the first time you properly see him. You see him from the back, and we kind of knew him as being the Mohawk Quincy. And he arrives at the Sun Gate with the rest of them, and he participates in the first invasion. He and Sternritter Yu Nananajakoop both attack the 3rd Division, with Bazz-B taking out Izuru Kira in one of the most shocking moments, really, of the series. Basically, Bazz-B's really the first Quincy you see launch the attack, which is pretty cool. But he's standing in the blue pillar of flame. They all surround him, and he basically blasts Kira from within inside the pillar. Now, again, this is probably not Burner Finger. This is probably just a stylistic way of drawing him firing an arrow, would be my assumption. Because, remember, of course, this is the first time, really, we got to see the Sternritter in action, so it makes sense for their initial introduction to be with an arrow. But so Kira is basically killed off by Bazz-B immediately. Then he proceeds to take out basically the 3rd Division's entire leadership, leaping forwards, grabbing, I think it's the 4th and the 5th seat, or the 5th and the 6th seat, something like that, grabs their heads, smashes them into the ground, killing them immediately, turns around and basically decapitates the 3rd seat, Riku. And immediately Bazz-B means business, and he takes off his hood and he says, I'm sorry, we're basically here to kill all of you. And that's when you see him properly for the first time in the spread of Sternritter. And it's cool that Kubo, again, clearly had plans for Bazz-B. He's the first, apart from Kyuge OP, the first real touchstone we get with the Sternritter. He's the one who makes the bold introduction. He's the one who gets to cast off his hood, and then it reveals all of the Sternritter at the same time. And I think that's a great intro for this character. It works really well. It establishes him as a major threat. And it's weird then that he basically never really shows up again in this first invasion. He's kind of handled a bit strangely, actually, early on. And before we move on, there was some kind of funny weirdness about his name for a long time. So basically, he's actually one of the first named Sternritter as well, except he doesn't have his name appear actually, on screen officially. He is called out by Nanana. So Rose and Nanana are talking, and Nanana says, if your man is still alive, that means Bazz-B has failed. And, back in the day, the translations, it was something like Bazz-B at one point, Buzzbee, and then it was Bazz-B, Busby. It took people ages to realise that his name was Bazz-B, which admittedly is pretty weird for a name. So, but it's just funny it just really gets me nostalgic to see those old panels in like Volume 56, where the Quincy first launched their attack, and I remember the theories going around about these individual characters. I remember calling them by their weird names, calling him either the Mohawk Quincy, because we didn't know for certain if it was even him. It was called Bazz-B, or Bazz-B even, now I'm saying it wrong. But it was really fun back in the day, and it's a different time. It's a totally different time when you think back about it. Nowadays we know all their names. Admittedly, we don't really know how to pronounce half of them, but we know all their names. We know how to spell them, all this sort of thing. It was like the Wild West back then. We had no idea who these characters really were. We had no idea what their names were. Yuha Buck was Johan Buck at one point. It was great. But Bazz-B then kind of disappears for ages, and then reappears to launch an attack on Yamamoto, basically to try and jump him when he's about to try and fight Yuha Buck. So he's there with Az and Nanana, and his only line is, time to die, old man. Again, kind of got that punkish, roguish attitude. But he gets obliterated by Yamamoto Shikai. Now, with Bazz-B, so again, you might not know this about me, but I was a massive fan of Az when he first showed up, and to see him get annihilated like that was pretty annoying. And then Bazz-B kind of offered some hope, because Bazz-B is the Sternritter we see that survived that initial attack by Yamamoto. He's charred, but he's still alive. And I thought that was interesting. But it was just funny to see that this Quincy, who we kind of thought was going to have some prominence, shows up right at the start, then attacks Yamamoto and gets annihilated, and that's basically all he does in the first invasion, which is kind of weird. Bazz-B is only really given characterization when we reach the Sternritter meeting in chapter 543, where we really get to see a bit more of what this character is all about. His distaste for authority immediately starts to come through. Yuha Buck basically sends ripples throughout the Sternritter when he reveals that he's going to make this complete unknown Uryu Ishida his heir, which presumably is maybe something that most of these characters are vying for, or at the very least they just wanted Hashwolf to be it, because Bazz-B even mentions that a bit later on, that if Hashwolf got it, they'd be alright with it. But it basically throws them all up in arms, and Bazz-B is the one who steps forward, and he's like, challenging Yuha Buck on this, but he gets stopped by Hashwolf, and it's here that Bazz-B first uses Hashwolf's nickname of Yugo. And so it's possible that Kubo had already fleshed out the entirety of their kind of backstory here, but I don't quite think so. Again, for reasons I'll talk about later on. But Bazz-B is very unhappy about this news. It's hilarious that the Sternritter are like served total complete bottles of wine. That's just so funny to me. And he just grabs one and throws it at the wall. And he's like, what the hell's going on here? And he basically says that he's going to go and challenge Yuha Buck about it. He's going to go to Yuha Buck's personal room, presumably, bash on the door and be like, why is this guy the heir? Which, of course, is incredibly bad news for him. But Hashwolf stops him, and Bazz-B starts challenging him. And it's here that you get this dynamic, this antagonistic duo properly for the first time in this arc. The character roles are being defined. Bazz-B says to Hashwolf, you're not annoyed about this enough. If you don't want that seat, I'll take it from you, and I'll be the new heir. And he starts, he's about to throw down with Hashwolf, again in a very Grim Joe fashion, but they are stopped by Askin. I really liked this chapter back in the day, but looking back on it, I don't think it did any favours for those reductive Grim Joe Ulquiorra comparisons. This was the first time we got to see the Sternritter outside of a battle setting, and I was really, really excited by that, but a lot of people did complain or did criticize that this was basically just felt like a rehash of the setup with the Espada. And, it's not too hard to see why. They do seem to slip into those roles more so in this chapter, but they get fleshed out in a different way moving forwards, which I thought was really good. The second invasion takes place, and Bazz-B again is one of the first characters to really get involved, and it's from this point forwards that Kubo really pushes Bazz-B into that spotlight. Bazz-B attacks the 10th Division, and he's stopped by Hitsugaya and Matsumoto. Their fight is really interesting because it's Bazz-B who really upturns expectations for how this fight is going to go. So it initially starts out like a very typical Bleach battle, with them kind of trading insults, trading blows, but Bazz-B just can't get past Hitsugaya and Rangiku's scheme. Until eventually he does, until eventually Kubo flips the switch, and Bazz-B is one of the best examples of how deadly the Sternritter actually are. He just completely turns the tables on Hitsugaya. There's a wonderful cliffhanger where he's like, well, where do you think you're going? I've not even started fighting yet. And he looks really kind of sinister as he just melts all of Hitsugaya's ice. The fight he has against Hitsugaya isn't so much a battle as it is a curb stomp. Bazz-B just chases down this captain like we've never really seen before. Blasting him with burner finger straight through the chest. Everything Hitsugaya does, Bazz-B can just counter immediately. Summons a massive wall of ice. Bazz-B cuts straight through it like it's nothing. Hitsugaya tries to create a kind of trap for Bazz-B, and Kubo is again playing with his own cliches. Like, it's very Hitsugaya to just kind of pull off this final move. But Bazz-B just breaks straight out of it, and it's like a horror movie. It's like a terrifying moment where Hitsugaya cannot do anything. And it's really, really effective as an early showcase of how dangerous these guys are actually going to be. Bazz-B's like, I wish you had your Bankai right now, because I'll just show you that one finger is enough to wipe this thing out. Your ice, you can't do anything. And when Bazz-B uses Burner Finger 2 on Hitsugaya, it's a scary moment. Like, he's looking crazed, and he's like, you're just trying to make me angry enough to use 2 fingers on you, and he strikes Hitsugaya across the chest, and we see that as it currently stands, the captains are not ready for this. Not only are they not ready, they don't stand a chance, and Bazz-B is really the guy who pushes that forwards. Of course, at this point, Kangdu arrives and steals Hitsugaya from him, in one of the worst upsets in the entire arc, unfortunately. But, it's kind of funny. Bazz-B's like complaining about it, saying, His Majesty won't like you taking my prey. And then he watches kind of from afar as Kangdu is beaten, and he's like, wow, that's really lame. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong. Kangdu got dealt a really bad hand in that fight, but Bazz-B, takes off to fight another day. There's a nice small moment of him watching the incoming meteor that Gremmy has summoned. He's like, what the hell have you done, Gremmy? As he kind of like rages out. And then he's seen again when he approaches Shinji, Momo, and Omaida after the Kenpachi fight is over. And this is what I mean about Bazz-B really flitting around the place. You see him briefly after his fight with Hitsugaya, you see him watching the meteor, then you see him here again. And it's a shame that this fight is not done anything with. It's just cut away from immediately. There's a nice little interaction here where Bazz-B's like, thanks for the lowdown on your plan, as he says to Shinji, and he's like, now I'm going to stop you in your tracks. And Shinji says, something like, were you going to try and get in my business, as he like grabs his Zanpakuto toe. But the fight is just not shown. It's a big shame. And Bazz-B just disappears again. And it's weird. It is weird, and he doesn't show up again until the big showdown with Ichigo. So when the Bambis have Ichigo surrounded, they suddenly get blasted through the back by a burner finger each, and Bazz-B arrives on the scene, and he's like, I'm going to be the one to take the glory for taking down Ichigo Kurosaki, but then he is surrounded as well by other Sternritter, and it turns out to be a big 8v1 kind of free-for-all battle against Ichigo. And again, it's kind of weird seeing Bazz-B lumped in with these guys. These guys are definitely not as important, generally speaking, as he is supposed to be. And in a way, he is given a little more prominence here than many of the other ones. He gets the closest to actually injuring Ichigo when he grabs him on the back and he tries to sort of burn a finger him in the face. Bazz-B also has his only interaction, really, with Ichigo in this scene earlier on when he says to Ichigo, victory, glory kills are saved for those who come in late. Isn't that right, Ichigo Kurosaki? And Ichigo doesn't say anything to him. So it's that real weirdness that Bazz-B is supposed to be. It feels like filling that Renji archetype, but he has nothing to do with Ichigo at all, and so that means he feels like he is really, in many ways, without a true purpose. But he engages Ichigo in that fight. It's really dynamic, it looks really cool, but then Renji arrives and saves Ichigo from Bazz-B. And you get this cool moment here where the Gotei 13 arrive to basically prevent the Sternritter from getting to Ichigo. That's what they all want, is to kill him and gain Yhwach favour. So the Gotei and the Sternritter have this big clash, but then Yhwach, Uryu and Hashwolf escaping into the royal palace creates a massive shockwave that separates everybody. And I remember thinking that that was obviously Kubo's way of setting up a bunch of fights, and it does set up some. This is where the Ikkaku Yumichika Mayuri versus Giselle comes from. This is where Byakuya versus Pepe comes from. And it's, again, weird to me that Kubo decided not to really focus on Bazz-B. Bazz-B ends up going up against Renji and Rukia, which again is a partnership I think people would have loved to have seen in a fight against a prolific Sternritter. And there is a really great character moment between the three of them, where basically Bazz-B overhears Renji and Rukia talking about Uryu, and he's like, oh yeah, I forgot you guys were friends with that guy. Well, we hate him as well, so if you want to take him down, I'll lend you a hand. And whether he's being facetious or not, it's difficult to say, but Renji basically brushes it off and says, you stupid chicken head, basically insulting his mohawk. And this is just a wonderful moment of a real character moment for a Sternritter. And Bazz-B's like, what the hell did you just say? He's like, did you just talk smack about this amazing mohawk of mine? And he just completely flies off the handle about Renji insulting his haircut. But the best part is that Bazz-B's like, I thought maybe you were a cool guy with a good fashion sense because you had awesome eyebrows, but now I see I was wrong. And Renji's like, you like my eyebrows? Oh my god, maybe you're a great guy after all. And Bazz-B's like, you're too late. And that's just such a good moment. It's such a good moment because it feels like Kubo wanted to build a rapport between Bazz-B and Renji. If he's going to have a relationship with somebody in the main cast, maybe it could be Renji, but they just don't spend anywhere near enough time together to really get that. But the time they do have is really nice, and you don't see them fight, which again is a shame, but the next time you see Bazz-B, that rapport between those two characters again is kind of hinted at. Rapport is maybe the wrong word, but they are quite similar, and they do seem to hit it off in some way. When Bazz-B is struck by the Auswählen, Renji shows genuine concern. He's like, Bazz-B, what the hell's going on? Even calls him by his name, and Bazz-B's like, I've no idea, I don't know what's happening. And he turns to Yhwach, and he's like, Your Majesty, is this how you do things? He's been betrayed, and he defiantly screams that he won't be killed in this manner. So, this is where, in my opinion, the story gets a little bit squiffy. It gets a little bit weird. This period of the second invasion, I would say, is probably the messiest part of the Thousand Year Blood War. The second half of the second invasion, I would say, is probably the messiest section. It's odd to me that Bazz-B isn't given really a proper fight in this series to call his own. It feels like there aren't really any characters like that. Bazz-B is a major villain in this arc, and now we've established already that the villain roles are different with the Sternritter because of their lack of real interaction with Ichigo, but there's no denying that Bazz-B is supposed to be a hotshot among them. He's supposed to be one that we get a lot of face time with. And so it's really weird that he doesn't have a defining fight, or at least I would say anyway. His battle against Hitsugaya it's good, it's visually cool, it's crazy to see a captain be dominated so badly. But because of that, it doesn't really feel like a proper fight. Bazz-B doesn't really have to try hard. And really, that fight is taken from him. Kang comes in, swoops in, and it becomes more about Hitsugaya getting his Bankai back. And in many ways, the Bazz-B half is kind of forgotten about. And then much later on, Bazz-B, I guess, gets his main fight against Hashwolf. But again, it's not a proper Shinigami versus Quincy battle. It's less of a fight than it is exposition regarding their backstory. I think Bazz-B needed a proper fight against a Shinigami, and Ichigo would have been perfect. Even if they don't have that traditional rivalry, it kills two birds with one stone because Ichigo needed a fight as well, desperately needed a big tentpole battle against a Sternritter. It kind of feels like they were star-crossed, they were meant to be, but they just missed each other. You know, they have that small interaction during the big skirmish, but these two characters could have had a good fight, and they both needed it. So it's a shame that Kubo never quite managed to make that happen. And it would have also really given weight to Bazz-B's prominence as well. Instead, he just feels like a Sternritter who shows up more than the others. And now we've also reached the part where I want to detail why I think Bazz-B's story was maybe tacked on a little bit towards the end. So basically what happens here is Bazz-B is hit by the Auswählen, survives it somehow, but presumably has his Vollständig stolen from him, although he keeps his Schrift, so he hasn't really lost all that much. But because of that, and he kind of contemplates the destruction of all the worlds as well. Yuha Bark has now destroyed the Soul King, everything is shaking, there's crazy earthquakes going on, and Bazz-B is like wondering. You know, you see him standing there, he doesn't look very happy about what's happening. Soldat around him are like, does His Majesty want to kill us as well? And so Bazz-B is quickly becoming disillusioned, and all of the Sternritter who survived the Auswählen, well, most of them anyway, apart from Nanana apparently, do feel like they've been abandoned by Yuha Bark in favour of his Schutzstaffel. But it's weird to me, because Bazz-B, at least according to his flashback, has never liked nor trusted Yuha Bark at all, and in fact wanted to kill him early on as a child, and actually attempted an assassination, only to be stopped by Hashwolf. So Bazz-B then joins the Sternritter as a means of getting close to Yuha and close to Hashwolf, and yet we're supposed to believe that early on this guy is willing to die to protect Yuha Bark when he jumps in against Yamamoto. We're willing to believe that he doesn't know already that Yuha Bark is a scheming, user of his men. He turns and looks up at Yuha when he gets hit by the Auswählen, like he had no idea this was going to happen. Like, he was like, is this really how you do things? You know it is. You hate Yuha Bark. You hated him all your life. So that is kind of weird to me. Like, that doesn't really make that much sense, which is why it feels like this whole thing with Bazz-B's backstory was kind of added in a little bit later on. But that being said, I don't have a problem with it because his backstory is really good stuff. But you get a really nice moment with this character. The Shinigami are scrabbling together in the wake of Yuha Bark escaping, kind of the dying down now of the second invasion. It's the royal palace that is now in real danger, and they're scrambling to try and get up there. And the surviving Sternritter arrive, Bazz-B, Lil Toto, Giselle, and Nanana. And Nanana, for whatever reason, is still blindly loyal to Yuha Bark, but Bazz-B blasts him through the back, taking him out with his Burner Finger 1, and says that they will lend the Shinigami a hand. It's a really cool moment. It's a bit of a watershed moment for this character in a way, because he kind of goes on a path of no return at this point. But really cool to see the Shinigami and the Quincy actually working together, as Eisen notes as well. And again, this is something I hope is expanded on in the anime a little bit, because you get to see Bazz-B once again interacting with Renji and Rukia, which I hope we actually get to see properly. While I don't think they could ever really be friends, I think there's a really cool dynamic that could be fostered there. But Bazz-B, Lil Toto, and Giselle then go up to Varvelt, Yuha Bark's new kingdom in the sky, where Bazz-B is hell-bent on taking down Yugrum Hashwolf, his former best friend. And it's at this point that we get all of the emotional core of Bazz-B's character. Now, I've done an entire video on the Friend Saga flashback, which you can check out. But for a kind of Cliff Notes version, these two existed about 1,000 years ago, back in, it looks kind of almost medieval times, although I don't think it's depicted quite that stringently. But Bazz-B was the son of a lord, he grew up in a massive castle, but Yuha Bark burned that castle to the ground. He razed it as part of his conquest of the Lichtreich, or the light world. And so Bazz-B has always wanted to bring Yuha Bark down, and he thought that, he could bring Hashwolf with him. He thought he was training young Yugrum, and they were both going to become incredibly powerful Quincy. Upon trying to join the Sternritter a few years later, however, Bazz-B realises, as Yuha Bark pins him to the ground with pure power, that actually Hashwolf has been giving Bazz-B strength all along, and that Bazz-B would be nothing without him. And this enrages Bazz-B. He goes crazy about it. He fires an arrow at Yuha. He's like, I'm trying to kill him. And of course, Hashwolf initiates the ultimate betrayal. And we see from this point on that eventually Bazz-B, despite his assassination attempt on the Emperor, which I'm surprised they didn't just kill him there and then, was eventually allowed to join the Vandenreich. And I'm guessing it's because Yhwach figured he could use that fire, that passion, in much the same way as they only recruited Arrancar that fought back. And so it is weird to me that Bazz-B did seem to, at least in some way, follow and worship Yhwach early on in the story, only for that to change. But regardless, it is an emotional backstory for this character, and I'm really glad we got it, because again, it helps him really stand out from the rest of the Sternritter. So few of these characters got any kind of a backstory whatsoever, and this friend saga between Hashwoth and Bazz-B is honestly really good. Not only is it great writing, but it gives us a fascinating insight into some of the earliest moments in the Bleach timeline as well. So I'm all for it, and I think it is really incredibly well handled. Their fight in the present day is nice as well. One of my low-key favourite exchanges in this arc is when Bazz-B is talking to Hashwoth about the Auschwellen, saying, you know, those of us who avoided the light were able to survive, but we lost our powers. Those of us who were struck were robbed of our life, apart from apparently Bazz-B, which again is a bit weird. But I love that Hashwoth is like, you have my sympathies, in like this totally cold, deadpan way. And really, it's because of this friend saga that I think Bazz-B is the best developed of this archetype since Renji himself. Even if there is that weirdness, that slight inconsistency perhaps in the way he is portrayed, the fact that it does feel like he is perhaps purposeless for a lot of the arc, I do think he is a great character, and I do think that this is a great capstone for his character as well, watching him struggle just to try and beat Hashwoth, to kind of prove that he can, and in the end Hashwoth just completely kills him, just cuts him down, and Bazz-B's like, you know, losing to you I thought would feel so much worse than this. And it's almost like he's accepted perhaps that Hashwoth is much stronger than him, and or always has been, or it's more that he kind of was afraid to confront Hashwoth. The thing is, Bazz-B is always saying to Hashwoth, you know, are you afraid to fight me? And that's been their thing for years now, that Bazz-B's constantly trying to start fights with him. Again, that's a similar relationship to Neutra and Nell. But eventually it seems like Bazz-B was really the one afraid to lose. You know, that's why he was starting fights, you know, because he wanted to always be winning, to always be better than Hashwoth. But eventually this fight is the better of him, and Hashwoth cuts him down. It's a really moving scene, and I think it's quite reminiscent of the Soul Society arc. And there's actually many different allusions to the Soul Society arc in the Thousand Year Blood War, and this I'd say is definitely one of them. Those small incremental panels that show every kind of movement, you know, Hashwoth cuts Bazz-B down, but there's a small, almost in slow motion, Bazz-B like turns to him and he reaches out in his hand and he grabs the kind of lapels on Hashwoth's coat, and he's like hanging there in front of him, and that's when he's, you know, I thought losing to you would feel much worse than this, and he just sort of collapses. Artistically done really, really well, and I feel like we haven't had something like that since maybe Ginjo's death, and Kubo generally tries to do a gut punch like that at least once an arc, and I thought it worked really well here. And so the friend saga that we got at the end of Bazz-B's story really elevated this character, I think, in many ways, and worked really well as a capstone for him, as Hashwoth just kind of leaves him to die at the foot of the stairs of Varville, kind of at the foot of Hashwoth's own ambition. But like I said, I have done a full video on that relationship, that backstory, so please do go and check it out if you're interested in learning more. But that is basically it for Bazz-B's character. He just sort of fades away, you see his eyes, and it's kind of tragic, really. I do think maybe Kubo should have done a little more a little earlier on, but what we do get is really good, and I think it works really well for the character. And of course, the ultimate gut punch comes when Hashwoth dies about about 50 chapters later. And his hand unfurls, and he has the pin that Bazz-B gave them as they were children. Really well done. Their relationship is well handled, to the point where I can overlook any foibles that might crop up when you look too deeply. But That is basically it for Bazard Black, the Heat Bazz-B. Definitely one of the most prominent Sternritter, even if it feels like he is a bit weirdly used overall, like he doesn't necessarily have a firm footing, a place to be in the story because he hasn't got that relationship with Ichigo. And so despite being one of the most prolific and prominent and significant Sternritter, he's kind of left to wander a bit, left to wander the battlefield. And I do think it kind of hurts him a little bit overall that he doesn't have a memorable fight when he really did deserve one. I'm not saying he doesn't have a memorable fight, that's not right, but he doesn't have a fight really to call his own. A big tent-pole battle against Bazz-B where he gets beaten up, he gets injured, a better Volstendig perhaps. But regardless, I am really happy with what we got with this character. And to circle back to my point I made at the start of this video, I think Bazz-B is a great example of how a Sternritter can be done right. And there are multiple as well. It's not just him either. But Bazz-B is definitely one of the most popular, and I think he will come away from the anime being one of the most popular as well. But that's it for this video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments below what you think of Bazz-B. What's your favourite Bazz-B moment in the series? And if Bazz-B got a proper fight to call his own, who would you have liked to seen him go up against? I remember, again, kind of going back to that reductive comparison, but people were desperate for something like Kenpachi versus Bazz-B, or Grimjo versus Bazz-B, or even Kensei, I think, came up at one point as well. But unfortunately, it wasn't meant to be. But let me know in the comments below, guys. Like I said, hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.